Okay, sir.
So you can resume.
Hello, Bede, you can please start.
Yeah, okay. I just want to turn this thing on. Good evening.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening, sir. Yeah. So my name is Bede, and we're talking about creative writing. Okay. So creative writing is it's a very deep and complex subject. In fact, as I always tell people, in fact, in some universities, you actually have an entire completely separate department of creative writing. So it's very broad. It's not really something you can cover in one Zoom class, obviously. So we're going to try and narrow it down. We'll try to focus on the general description of creative writing. Then I'll talk to you about how to think about a story. And then we'll look at how to write creatively. So we'll try and cover those three topics within, I think, an hour or an hour and a half. How much time do we have?
Oh, Bede, you have like an hour, 45 minutes, an hour. Just so you know.
Okay, all right then. Okay. So creative writing is different because it uses the imagination. That's the major difference between creative writing and other forms of fiction or other forms of fiction or I think other forms of fiction, other forms of writing. You have academic writing where you're strictly looking at trying to talk about a particular theory or discuss something in an academic setting. You have business writing. You even have other forms of nonfiction, like your biographies or your memoirs. But when we talk of course, there are some forms of nonfiction that are fused with creative writing. They're called creative nonfiction. You write someone's true life story, but in a creative way. So creative writing revolves around storytelling. That's one of the main things about being a creative writer. You have to know how to tell a story because you're not exploring a highly structured process like in academic writing or discussing some cases or in business writing. You're essentially trying to present things the way they could be in real life. So creative writing is one of the closest forms of writing to real life. You have to bring your imagination to the page. You have to bring personality and flair. It has to be storytelling. That's what makes it different to other forms of writing. So we do have different forms of creative writing. There's your poetry, song lyrics, journals and diaries, plays and screenplays, personal essays. You have your short fiction, you're writing short stories. There's also flash fiction, could probably feature in a newspaper column. Sometimes some flash fiction is as short as 50 words. Then you have your long fiction, which is mostly your novel, or your novellas as well could come into that. And then you have letters. These are all forms of creative writing. Let's take a look at an example of a poem, Robert Frost's Fire and Ice. Some say the world will end in fire, some say in ice. From what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. But if it had to perish twice, I think I know enough of hate to say that for destruction, ice is also great and would suffice. Can you tell me anything you see? Can you point out anything you see in this poem? Anybody? Just anything? There's no right or wrong answer. It's just a couple of things. What comes to you when you look at this poem?
I think the writer is trying to
Okay, the rhyme is okay.
Make a case between the word ending, make a case for the word ending between fire and ice, trying to compare them, taking the position.
Yeah, exactly, actually. So the contrast between fire and ice is what really makes this poem stand out. So on the one hand you have fire, on the other hand you have ice. So contrast is the key element. This poem is so pointed because of that contrast. So contrast is actually a very key element that you find in creative writing. You put the opposite of something, really close to another thing, and when you juxtapose them like that, people are able to see the differences between the two. You can also do something like this with characters as well. But we'll probably try and maybe we'll probably talk about that in a few. So this is an example of creative writing. It's a poem, but like I said, creative writing is broad. The when we talk about creative writing, probably the most common part of creative writing you'll find is the long fiction, which is the novel. Of course, maybe also the short fiction where people are trying to write short stories and all that. But poetry and journals and letters and all sorts all fall into what you categorize as creative writing. Elements of creative writing include the character. Who is in the story? Who are you talking about? Who are the people acting in your story? Plot, how is the story organized? Setting, where is it happening? Is it happening, if your story is happening in Lagos, it's going to be different to how it's happening in Kano or Katsina. It's going to be different to how it's happening in Spain. But also the time, when is it happening? These are all key aspects of the story. The theme is the central idea. The motif is a symbol that you probably find, a symbol that reoccurs in the story. It can also be something consistently appearing in different kinds of stories. So you have a particular symbol that goes on across stories. The freedom of the writer is one. The freedom of freedom, imagination is one type of motif that you probably found in English novelists who are writing in the in the essay in the 1900s, in the 1800s, maybe not the 1900s, in the 1800s, most of them were talking about this kind of freedom, how you can put your imagination into use, you know. That's a motif. It's something that consistently appears across stories. Conflict is extremely important. It's the problem that needs solving in the story. Conflict is usually caused by an inciting incident. The inciting incident creates a motivation in the characters to go about whatever business the plot has in store for them. So, you know, take note of these three words: conflict, inciting incident, motivation. Inciting incident is the event that disrupts the protagonist's life and thrusts them into the plot. It can be a character's death, injury, meeting someone new, or even a visit from an old friend. In Game of Thrones, you know, the king, Robert, visits his friend, Ned Stark. This is probably the inciting incident in this story because it actually sets off a chain of events that, you know, begin to unfold across the story. Although, well, maybe you can argue that Robert really wouldn't have come to Winterfell if not for the murder of John Arryn. So you could say that key element, the death of John Arryn, you know, the murder of John Arryn was the inciting incident in this story. You know, trying to resolve his murder led to, you know, letting the characters do all the things that they did in the story. And even when the murder was eventually solved, you know, things had escalated to the point that it was really impossible to prevent a war. In Harry Potter, you have Hagrid visiting Harry on his birthday to tell him that, you know, he's a wizard. And that essentially sets off everything that happened in the stories. You do have some characters who they don't really, you know, they're not really, some protagonists are passive, you know, they don't go out and do the story. So they don't really there's really no inciting incident. It's really like the things happening in the story are happening to them. You know, it's not really because of decisions they make. An example of this is Kambili in Chimamanda Adichie's Purple Hibiscus, if you've read that story. So it's mostly focusing on the feelings and, you know, how Kambili responds to decisions that are taken by people around her, you know, her dad, her mom, her brother, not really Kambili herself. So there's not so much of an inciting incident in the story because she's a passive kind of character. So if you're writing a story, you probably have to decide whether your protagonist is an active person who is pushed by an inciting incident into the plot, or she's a passive one who just, you know, allows the events around them to happen to them. Your motivation. You know, why is your character doing what they're doing? You know, motivation is actually as simple as asking yourself, why would my character do this? You know, what are they hoping for? What is their reward in the end? You know, in Game of Thrones, the reason that the Ned Stark wants to go to King's Landing and help, you know, and become the hand of the king is because he actually wants to help his friend Ned. His friendship with he wants to help his friend Robert. His friendship with Robert is actually what drives him. And then, you know, there's also his love for family and then his loyalty, which probably even gets him killed in the end. But essentially, you know that Ned Stark he's curious about John Arryn, you know, his friendship, honor, family. These are the things that he holds dear. You know, you want to compare that to people like the Lannisters, who are actually driven by their love for wealth, power, control. So when you're writing your motivation, try to make sure that what your characters are doing is what everyday people around you would or actually could do. So do you have any questions around this point? Conflict, motivation, inciting incident. Okay, so let's look at the language, because when you're writing in creative writing, you need to use interesting language. Okay.
I was to ask a question.
All right.
All right. My question on both the conflict, motivation, and the rest is, if any of these elements is missing, would the writer still be qualified as a creative writing?
Well, the one thing is it's impossible. So when I said that the conflict is the most important or extremely important, it's actually impossible to have a story without conflict. You know, even in heaven, there's conflict, and there was war in heaven. And so if you're right, even if you're right, there was a film called Wedding Party. Like I said, creative writing is of different forms. So if you're writing a script, it's also a form of creative writing. So in the film, The Wedding Party, it's a wedding. It's somebody's wedding. It's the happiest moment of your life, but it's also full of incredible conflicts. How are we going to prepare the cake? How are we going to get the guests? And there's all sorts of things happening, and then people are coming and everybody's, interacting, and all of those things are causing issues. So it's impossible to have a story without conflict. The important thing to ask yourself is, as the writer, are you managing the conflict well? Because if you're not, then it's like you're not really in control of the story. But certainly there's conflict in every story. Now, if I take the example of a wedding, the inciting incident could be, it could actually be, well, maybe when you agree to marry the person, and then it sets up a chain of events that actually affects you. So it's impossible to have a story without conflict. There will always be something if you want to have a story. If I also point out your own life and I want to write a story on you, there's going to be conflict. If I'm writing your biography, I'm going to pull out conflicts in your story. And there are going to be inciting incidents if you're an active person, unless you're a passive character who things around your life actually happen to you rather than you actually going out to make them happen. So, and there's going to be motivation. Everything you're doing, you have to have a reason. You don't just, operate like, even AI has a prompt. AI won't just start talking unless you prompt it. So there's a motivation. So these elements are actually impossible to have, impossible not to have in a writing. So what really matters is whether you can manage it as a writer. Yeah. Any other questions? Is that clear? Any questions around that?
All right, copy that. Thank you.
Okay. So you need to use interesting language. How you use language will make your readers want to carry on with your story. Just imagine it's not like a film where there are thousands of pictures you can watch in minutes. Rolling through your screen, keep you engaged. Even music in films creates a melody that evokes these strong emotions inside you to make you want to keep listening or watching. With writing, there's really nothing like that. You have to rely on words. So how, as a creative writer, how you use those words is really important. You have to bring them to life. You have to say ordinary things in creative ways. You have to paint pictures in the heads of your readers. They can't see it on screen. So they really have to rely on mental pictures. Your words have to evoke those mental pictures. One way to do this, of course, is by using literary devices like contrast, as we saw in the poem. We can also use it by your choice of words. Here's an example from Margaret Atwood's The Testaments. The main character is actually losing their faith. And this is what Atwood says about it. I feared I might lose my faith. If you've never had a faith, you will not understand what that means. You feel as if your best friend is dying, that everything that defined you is being burned away, that you'll be left all alone. You feel exiled, as if you're lost in a dark wood. It was like the feeling I'd had when Tabitha died. The world was emptying itself of meaning. Everything was hollow. Everything was withering. So here, Atwood paints the picture of the main character who is losing their faith. And look at the words that Atwood uses. You feel as if your best friend is dying. Which doesn't just stop at that. She also says, being burned away. Something that defined you is being burned away. You feel left all alone. You feel exiled. And then she compares it to being lost in a dark wood. And then she compares it to the feeling you have when a close friend dies, when Tabitha died. And then you have words like hollow, withering. These words paint the picture of pain and anguish and isolation. And that's how she feels that, that's how she wants you to know that the main character was feeling when she was losing her faith. So try and think of creative ways to say the things you're saying, instead of saying very tired, why not say exhausted? And instead of saying really good, why not say excellent? Phrases like really hungry, you could replace them with famished or starving. If you replace so angry with furious, you can have something like, when I came home that night, I saw that he was raging. The raging there is probably better than very angry. As a rule, in creative writing, if you need to avoid using the word very, as a rule. If you're using very, it probably means that the word that comes after it is the wrong one. So try to think of different ways to say those creative things. Another way to use language is through vivid descriptions of your characters and settings. And here's an example from Chinua Achebe's Arrow of God. So do this so I can, okay. As soon as he'd made his offer and it was refused, Okeke Oneni rose to go, although the first sporadic drops of a heavy rain had started to fall. Won't you wait and watch the face of the sky a while? Asked Idogo. No, my son, replied Okeke Oneni, and feigning lightheartedness, added, only those who carry evil medicine on their body should fear the rain. He walked out into the coming storm. The darkness was lit up at short, irregular intervals by lightning. Sometimes it was a strong, steady light. Sometimes it flickered before it went out, as if the rushing wind shook its flame. Okeke Oneni's voice rose powerfully against the wind and thunder as he sang and whistled a song to keep him company in the dark. The important thing, if you look at those final two lines, his voice rose powerfully against the wind and thunder. Before that, it describes what happens as he walks out into the coming storm. It talks about the darkness. The darkness is lit up. So the opposite of darkness is light. So there's darkness. The darkness is lit up at short, irregular intervals by lightning. So there's this kind of contrast. There's this kind of battle between the elements. Irregular intervals by lightning. And then sometimes there's a strong, steady light. So sometimes the darkness doesn't stay, sometimes the light stays steady, sometimes it flickers and goes out, and then there's the rushing wind shaking its flame. So all of these elements are battling with each other in the night. So that kind of paints an image of it's a really tense, it's a really crazy atmosphere outside. But then Okeke Oneni goes into this storm. He goes into the darkness. He goes into these elements fighting each other. But then his voice, as it's described, his voice actually rises more powerfully than the wind. Because if you look at this, there's darkness. The darkness itself is being, fought by the lightning, and it seems sometimes it's a strong, steady light, as if the light itself is stronger than the darkness. But then sometimes the rushing wind shakes the flame of the lightning, of the light. And then Okeke Oneni's voice actually rises powerfully against the wind and thunder. So he's braving the elements, essentially. So when you're creating a scene, there are different kinds of elements at play. It's not just the human characters. There's the house, there's the atmosphere, there's the feeling generated by the interaction of the characters. There are natural forces. You have to touch on these elements not just one of them. So you need to ask yourself, what is the interplay? What is the relationship between the one character or a few characters and the natural forces? One common mistake that new writers make is that they just completely, a work I was reviewing recently, just completely ignore all these other elements in the background. You just want to rush out and narrate the plot you already have in mind. But you have to think of these different elements and how they affect your story. Because when you do that, you actually bring in the story to life, and your readers can participate in the action. So they're not just reading a newspaper, they're actually witnessing the story. Here's an example from Chimamanda Adichie's Purple Hibiscus. Jaja did not move. Bar swayed from side to side. I stood at the door watching them. The ceiling fan spun round and round, and the light bulbs attached to it clinked against one another. Now, in this scene, Jaja is rebelling against their father, and there's really a massive argument, and then the father throws a missile, which Jaja dodges, and then it destroys something. And then she's narrating the story, Adichie. She talks about Jaja. Look at this. Look at the time she gives to each character. One sentence to Jaja. Jaja did not move. Another sentence to Papa. He swayed from side to side. Another sentence to the protagonist. I stood at the door watching them. And then another sentence, not to these characters, but to the ceiling fan. The ceiling fan spun round and round. Then it's kind of like a complex sentence because he also talks about the light bulbs. The light bulbs attached to it clinked against one another. She gives almost equal weight to all of these elements. So it's not just the three humans there, but then there's the fan, it's spinning, there's the light bulbs, they're clinking. And then what does this paint to you? What would happen? What would make you hear the sound of the ceiling fan spinning round and round? What would make you hear the light bulbs clinking against one another? It's because there's silence in the scene. It's incredibly quiet. So when you read this, when you feel this, it not only does it kind of delay the tension or delay the events to create tension, but also you feel other things happening. You can read other things happening, and you will enjoy the story more than when the writer just tries to narrate the story. There was a fight, and then just focusing on the human character. You have to explore the other elements involved in the scene. It's not just the humans. In J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, look at this passage. When Harry pushed open the tapestry to take their usual shortcut up to Gryffindor Tower, however, they found themselves looking at Dean and Ginny, who were locked in a close embrace and kissing fiercely as though glued together. It was as though something large and scaly erupted into life in Harry's stomach, clawing at his insides. Hot blood seemed to flood his brain, so that all thought was extinguished, replaced by a savage urge to jinx Dean into a jelly. Wrestling with this sudden madness, he heard Ron's voice as though from a great distance away. There are two paragraphs here. The first paragraph talks about the scene. They came to this shortcut. They found two people kissing. One of them, the girl, is actually Harry's love interest. And then the second paragraph does not talk about the scene anymore. It focuses on the eternal struggle that Harry is facing at that moment. It's describing something large and scaly coming alive inside his stomach, flowing at his insides. And then this particular beast that erupts into life, it actually becomes a motif in this story because it doesn't just happen in this scene. It consistently appears. So anytime, because Harry's love interest, Ginny, actually has different relationships with different boys across the story. So as anything involving romance happens, the beast starts to react inside Harry. So that's a motif. It's a symbol that appears across the story. So, but by the time that Harry is able to finally establish a relationship with Ginny in the story, then the writer describes the beast actually going to sleep. So here you can see that enough attention just as much attention in the scene is devoted to off the scene, inside Harry, to describe how he's feeling in that moment. So you have to consider some of these elements, and you have to think about, narrating more than just, the different characters in the scene. You have to think of other elements. You have to think of the internal motivations. There's nothing wrong with taking a few paragraphs to describe how the person is feeling, describe the setting, describe the scene. Sometimes you completely ignore the story and you start to talk about ants crawling on the windows. All of these things are trying to set up that scene, And then, of course, the most important element of language in creative writing, show, don't tell. Okay, a popular writer, Anton Chekhov, says, "Don't tell me the moon is shining, show me the glint of light on broken glass." But actually, this is a kind of a short paraphrase of what Anton Chekhov said. What he actually said in this right box here is the actual quotation is, "In descriptions of nature, one must seize on small details, grouping them, so that when the reader closes his eyes, he gets a picture. For instance, you have the moonlit night. If you write that on the mill dam, a piece of glass from a broken bottle glittered like a bright little star under the black shadow of a dog or a wolf rolled past like the ball." So what he's saying is, you don't have to mention what happened. You can just describe the things in the scene that clearly suggest that that thing is happening. For instance, I don't have to tell you it was nighttime and the moon was shining. I can just say that a puddle of water beside his feet reflected the ghostly moonlight. By saying that, you can already tell that it's night, and you can tell that the moon is shining. Okay, here's an example from Philip Pullman's The Northern Lights. Lyra clenched herself, but relaxed, almost at once, as Pantaleimon thought to her, "We're safe as long as we pretend." She opened her eyes and found that they'd been containing tears. And to her surprise and shame, she sobbed and sobbed. In this story, Lyra is really scared and she's frightened, but the writer does not tell us that. She doesn't tell us that Lyra is afraid. She just goes ahead to show us what Lyra is her actions at the time. She opened her eyes and found that they'd been containing tears. Her surprise, her shame, she sobbed. And she doesn't say she cried. She says, he doesn't say she cried. She says she sobbed. So which is a kind of a deeper, more heartfelt way of expressing emotion than actually just crying. It's, she doesn't even know how to cry out loud anymore. Here's an example from Stephanie Meyer's New Moon. I felt the smooth wooden floor beneath my knees, and then the palms of my hands, and then it was pressed against the skin of my cheek. I hoped that I was fainting, but to my disappointment, I didn't lose consciousness. The waves of pain that had only lapped at me before now reared high up and washed over my head, pulling me under. I did not resurface. Now here, the main character, Bella, actually collapses. But Mia doesn't tell us that she collapses. She says, I felt the wooden floor beneath my knees, and then the palms of my hands, and then pressed against the skin of my cheek. She has fallen to the ground. She doesn't tell us she fell to the ground. She describes the action. She hopes she's fainting. She doesn't lose consciousness. But then the waves of pain wash over her head and pull her under. She doesn't resurface. So she actually faints. And this is because the main character here, Bella, actually, she there's terrible news. She learns some really terrible news, and then she can't control it anymore. And she faints. But she doesn't actually, she says she hopes she's fainting. She doesn't describe her, she doesn't actually tell us that, oh, she has fainted or she collapses to the floor. No, she just describes the way that the action happens. Here's an example from my own story where, there are two characters in love, and then towards the end of the story, this happens. Suddenly, there was an explosion beside him. Odo fell to his face, thrown down by the impact. Scrap metals, upset by the explosion, rained down on him. When he had settled, he managed to pull himself up. Eunice, he shouted, to no avail. The infiltrators were still firing, and the platoon responded accordingly. Odo ignored the fusillade and started ransacking the place. Eunice, he shouted again. A sigh struck him and he flinched. The stream in the innermost recesses of his mind flowed somber as he saw the worst sight of his life. It was the broken, mangled body of Eunice, with one part of it crushed under a giant wheel. Here, there's no mention of Eunice dying. It doesn't say that Eunice died. There was an explosion. Something happens. It doesn't mention that the explosion struck Eunice. It doesn't talk about that. It just describes the scene. He fell to his face, those scrap metals, he's shouting the girl's name. There's no answer. People are firing in the background. Just like to say, you just describe, the people in the immediate, the people who, that the thing is happening to. The infiltrators are firing, the platoon is responding. He ignores the fusillade, he's ransacking the place, and then it just says he found something, and what he found was the broken body of Eunice. It doesn't actually mention that Eunice has died or that the explosion happened to Eunice, but you can see that from the descriptions. So it's important to not tell the people what has happened, but decide to describe the characters' reactions, the events, the characters' reactions to these events, describe the things in the scene rather than telling them what happened. And this can be summarized in this. Show us the symptoms of the emotion, situation, or event, not the emotion, situation, or event itself. Okay, so the most important thing is for us to know what are the things that happen because of this. If the sun is shining, what are the symptoms of the sun shining on the people, on the humans, on the cars, on the country? What is it doing in that scene? Don't just tell us about that event. Okay, if somebody is feeling anguished, don't just tell us, oh, the character was anguished. What are the symptoms of that anguish? Is the character shivering? Is the character weeping? Is the character sobbing? These are the things you need to describe in order to bring your story to life. But of course, you have to be cautious with this. Imagine you had to describe every single emotion or all the different interactions of your characters with the atmosphere and the environment. Your story will be longer than a list of Nigeria's problems. Which brings me to another element, pacing. Okay, in your story, you have to select when things happen. The number of words needed to write about a certain event does not depend on how much time the event takes to happen. It depends upon how important that moment is to the story. So you need to pick out the significant moments of your story, the moments that make key impact. You want to build tension, you want to convey an emotional impact. You have to pick those moments and then you rush through the other ones. You can also use pacing to reflect the passing of time. If you want time to go really quickly, you can cover an entire month within a page by just increasing the pacing. But if you want to focus on specific key events, then you can slow down the pacing of the story. Okay, so you can't describe the emotions all the time. You have to pick individual key moments of the story, and that's really, you have to be the one to decide that in your story. I'm going to show you an example. I hope I can. Come on, follow me. He called back over his shoulder and he hurried forward. I'll just stay with me for a while for this. But his hope soon changed to bewilderment and alarm. The dark patches grew darker, but they shrank. And suddenly he saw, towering ominous before him, and leaning slightly towards one another, like the pillars of a headless door, two huge standing stones. He couldn't remember having seen any sign of these in the valley. When he looked out from the hill in the morning, he had passed between them almost before he was aware. And even as he did so, darkness seemed to fall around him. His pony reared and snorted, and he fell off. When he looked back, he found that he was alone. The others had not followed him. Sam, he called. Pippin, Mary, come along. Why don't you keep up? There was no answer. Fear took him, and he ran back past the stones, shouting wildly, Sam, Sam, Mary, Pippin. The pony bolted into the mist and vanished. From some way off, or so it seemed, he thought he heard a cry. Hoy, Frodo, hoy! It was away eastward, on his left, as he stood under the great stones, staring and straining into the gloom. He plunged off in the direction of the call and found himself going steeply uphill. As he struggled on, he called again and kept calling on and kept on calling more and more frantically, but he heard no answer for some time. And then it seemed faint and far ahead and high above him. Frodo, hoy! Came the thin voices out of the mist, and then a cry that sounded like help, help, often repeated, ending with the last help. I trailed off into a long wail, suddenly cut short, stumbled forward with all the speed he could towards the cries. But the light was now gone, and clinging night had closed about him, so that it was impossible to be sure of any direction. He seemed all the time to be climbing up and up. Only the change in the level of the ground at his feet told him when he at last came to the top of a ridge or hill. He was weary, sweating, and yet chilled. It was wholly dark. Where are you? He cried out miserably. And this is a line from, this is a section from J.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. This last sentence, where are you? He cried out miserably, actually sums up the past couple of paragraphs. The character is miserable because he has lost his friends, his companions. They're traveling, they're actually on a journey, they're traveling east. And then he loses them in the forest. And he can't find them, and he's miserable about it. And then the writer takes some time to describe it. And the way he prolongs it, even you start to feel miserable by reading all the descriptions. The descriptions actually go way longer than this. You know, at a point, you yourself, you start to get frustrated by what's happening. You start to get, can we just find his friends? You know, because the writer wants you to feel the same misery, the same anxiousness, the same anxiety that the character is feeling. And that's why he really slows down the pace in this section. So you have to think of specific moments when you feel that the characters, the feeling of the characters needs to be conveyed to the readers. And that's when you think about slowing down the pacing. So essentially, as I said, you know, you have to use language to show how important a moment is, but you can't do it all the time. You can't show those symptoms all the time. So you have to pick your moments. You have to think of moments that create impact in the readers. You have to think of moments that are so important to the story. You want to, so you, when you find those moments, then you can take your time. You delay the action. You know, you describe the settings. You describe the other elements that are playing a role in the scene. So I just want to avoid the regular endings that just say, okay, does anybody have a question? So even if you don't have a question as well, I would like to get your comment on this. What you think generally about creative writing, what you think about this, some of the things we've discussed. And, you know, of course, if you also have something that you would like to clarify, you can also, we can also talk about it. So what do you think?
Okay, thank you, Bede. Very interesting one. Just so curious. Try to see how I could make use of or integrate some part of some elements of creative writing into my work. I'm a security practitioner. I do lots of technical
A what? A
writing.
what practitioner?
Security practitioner.
Okay, all right.
Lots of technical writing, investigation writing, project
Okay,
reports, and all of that. So specifically, let me take investigative writing, for example,
okay.
because we talked about pacing and just resonated with me that there are times why fiction and findings about an incident, you could either take your time to describe every single scene, one after
Yeah,
the other, bit by bit, and all of that. You could also decide to just wrap it up in just a few sentences. So,
yeah.
not necessarily a question, but I'm looking at is it also possible to always include this sort of this elements of creative writing?
Always include, I didn't get that.
Is it possible to
What?
include some element of this creative writing into some other kinds of writing that are not necessarily creative
Yeah,
writing?
exactly. So when you talked about, technical writing and all sorts, I was going to that came to my mind. Now, the thing about creative writing, like I said, it's incredibly broad and it's not limited. And we found a poem where you talked about when there's creative writing at play there as well. So most writing these days is there's always space, unless you're writing something heavily formal, like you have in academic writing. Most of the time, it's actually, it can only improve your writing to also include elements of creativity into them. I've had to write business case studies, for instance, where it's been it's important to think about it in a creative way and to infuse elements of creative writing. Um, so an example is somebody just writing just an ordinary post talking about, let's say you're talking about you're discussing spoilers. Okay, you're talking about spoilers. It's a blog post where you're discussing spoilers and how they affect spoilers. I mean, film spoilers or yeah, so film spoilers, and you're talking about how it affects people and how it's people are having to avoid it, and then you don't just describe the spoilers or describe why you need to talk about that. You actually paint pictures of the problem happening. Okay, so one of the key things about what you can do in most writing that is not academic writing is you paint pictures of the problem. You talk about the problem and then you talk about the solution. So the problem can actually benefit a lot from describing actual events of the problem, not just telling us about it. That's what I'm trying to point. So the example I have is there's a person who's describing how movie spoilers affect people. He doesn't just talk about, oh, spoilers are a problem. He describes how his wife is trying to avoid spoilers that weekend. He says, as I'm writing this at the moment, my wife is desperately trying to avoid spoilers. She has logged off her Facebook account. She has done this, she's done that. Okay. So that's you describing the problem or describing symptoms of the problem rather than just telling people, oh, there's an issue. So I can decide to write something about security, for instance, and rather than just saying, oh, insecurity is a problem, I describe the scenario, or I just briefly talk about the scenario where insecurity is a problem. And then I say, okay, fine, how do you solve this problem? So by that, you're already, infusing an element of creativity into your work. So yeah, definitely. And then there's also the aspect of the choice of language, okay? It's using language that impacts the reader is so important in all forms of writing. Okay. Um, you can avoid things like very, like I said before, and you can avoid things like so, and then find a word that can create stronger impacts. Okay. I can, instead of saying that I feel terribly, I'm upset about this, instead of saying I'm upset about this, you can say my heart is bleeding. So some of these things are all elements that you can, actually add to all kinds of writing. So, but it really depends on you being able to absorb these elements of creative writing properly and then translating them into your own work. So yeah, it's totally possible.
Okay, that's good. Thank you.
We did get some quiet from the rest of the participants. Was there anybody else who listened? Did you pick anything? Is there anything you would like to clarify?
Hello, if you have any questions, comments, this is the time to do so. So I believe we are now saying it's self-explanatory. That means the facilitator has done a very good job this evening. Thank you so much, Bede. Thank you so much for coming to speak with the interns today. And we hope to probably see you next time. Probably in the next internship. Right. Hopefully. Thank you so much. To the rest of us, do have a lovely evening. Yeah. Do have a lovely evening, and let's try as much as possible to do our bits in this internship. Time is fast spent, so at this junction, I will say good night, everyone.
Thank you, Bede. Thank you, Mary.